The power died mid-brew, and the worst part wasn't the ruined pot of coffee. It was the silence that followed. The low hum of my greenhouse fans cutting off, the temperature monitors clicking dead, the irrigation pump coughing its last drip. In the span of seconds, my entire setup went from humming order to suffocating stillness. That greenhouse wasn't just a hobby, it housed years of work. Rare seedlings, grafted fruit trees, delicate vines I'd coaxed from seed like an orchestra conductor nursing sound from silence. And now, one stupid outage was enough to undo it all. I stormed outside barefoot, mug in hand, only to freeze at the sight of Karen, our neighborhood's self-appointed queen bee and president of the HOA, standing at the side of my house with a bright orange extension cord trailing from my breaker panel. She had dug up my conduit box like a raccoon on a midnight snack run, wires exposed, panel open, and her smug face looking like she'd just finished solving world hunger. Except she wasn't solving anything, she was stealing. "Oh, don't worry, I'm just helping with community maintenance," she chirped, as if her screwdriver in my power line made her some sort of public servant. The cord slithered across the grass, disappearing into the street where her brand-new ATV sat parked, humming faintly as it charged from my line. I just stood there, coffee dripping down my wrist, caught between laughing at the absurdity and lunging at her with the mug. "You're stealing my electricity," I said flatly. No yelling, no drama. Just the calm, sarcastic tone I knew would drive her nut. Karen gasped, clutching her chest like I'd accused her of running a Ponzi scheme instead of literally siphoning power from my home. "Stealing? Oh no, sweetie, this is community property. The HOA voted last week to allow shared access to unused resources. And you," she waved her screwdriver like a conductor's baton, "you have way more than you need." That was the moment I realized she wasn't just delusional, she was dangerous. Not because she was smart, but because she was just dumb enough to believe her own lies and just powerful enough to make others believe them too. I told her to pack up the cord, close my panel, and never touch my wiring again. She smirked like I'd just recited a bedtime story. "I'll consider your request," she said. Then she snapped her panel cover shut and walked off, leaving the cord where it was, her ATV still sipping juice like a fat mosquito on my arm. By the time I disconnected the mess, the greenhouse was already warming. My rare orchids drooped like tired soldiers. A few of the seedlings were already beyond saving. Years of patience ruined, all because Karen had decided her Sunday joyride mattered more than my livelihood. Later that night, I dug deeper, literally. My meters didn't lie. I pulled the logs and saw the spike clear as day. Someone had been drawing load off my line for weeks. Karen hadn't just started today. She'd been siphoning for who knows how long, probably powering that ATV and whatever else her greedy little empire needed. The kicker? My bill had doubled, and I'd been chalking it up to seasonal usage. The next HOA meeting confirmed my suspicions. Karen stood at the front, brandishing a folder like she was unveiling the cure for cancer. "We're officially designating underutilized utilities as shared assets," she declared, her eyes locking with mine like she was daring me to object. "This ensures equity for all residents." I asked her point-blank if she considered my privately installed solar and battery backup part of these shared assets. She didn't even blink. "Of course. You can't hoard resources while others struggle." The room nodded like sheep, her voice dripping with authority. I was surrounded by neighbors too timid to challenge her, or too gullible to see through the lie. Fine. If Karen wanted a war over wires, I'd give her one. Not with shouting or fists, that wasn't my style. No, my war would be played quietly, patiently, with every ounce of technical know-how she underestimated me for having. So I let her keep charging. Let her ATV guzzle my power like a spoiled teenager raiding the fridge. I wanted her hooked, reliant, blind to the trap I was already building. Because Karen thought she'd stolen from a pushover. What she didn't know was that I was already setting the stage for her pride and joy, the shiny ATV she flaunted every weekend, to betray her in the most spectacular way imaginable. And when it did, the fire would be hers, not mine. That was the moment I decided. Karen had dug into my wiring. Now I'd dig into hers, metaphorically and electrically, until the whole neighborhood saw her for exactly what she was. The game had just begun. Karen didn't notice the way I watched her every move that week. She was too busy revving her shiny toy like a teenager showing off Daddy's car keys. Every morning before work she'd take the ATV out onto the neatly trimmed cul-de-sac, circling once or twice just to make sure every neighbor saw her. It wasn't just transportation, it was a status symbol. Loud, obnoxious, and a constant reminder that she thought the rules of the neighborhood bent around her. I played the part of the harmless, frustrated neighbor. I complained at meetings, I shook my head when she zoomed past, I even made a few sarcastic remarks under my breath. That was exactly what she wanted, me painted as a powerless crank while she stood tall as the self-appointed monarch of the HOA. What she didn't know was that I'd already mapped out her whole electrical setup in my head. Every time she plugged in to steal my juice, I studied the current, noted the draw, and made sure I understood exactly how much that overpowered toy of hers was leaching. I wasn't guessing anymore. I had data. The funny thing about electricity is that it doesn't forgive arrogance. You can talk your way out of fines, you can bluff your way through meetings, but volts don't bend to ego. They obey physics, and physics doesn't care about Karen's crown. I decided to let physics speak for me. But first, I needed to set the trap. The obvious revenge. Cutting her cord, locking my panel, filing a police report, was too easy, too short-sighted. Karen thrived on conflict because she always had a louder voice, a bigger audience. If I confronted her, she'd spin it until I looked like the villain. No, I needed her downfall to come from her own hand, so undeniable that even the sheep in the HOA flock couldn't baw their way out of it. Step 1 was patience. I made a show of locking up my breaker panel, installing a small box with a key, and muttering loud enough for her to hear about safety. Sure enough, 2 nights later, the lock was broken and her cord was back in place. She didn't even hide it anymore. She thought my precautions were laughable. I pretended not to notice, all while quietly rerouting my setup. I dug a second line from my battery array, hidden under the gravel along the side of the house. It bypassed my main breaker entirely, feeding into a dummy socket I installed near the edge of my property, an outlet I knew Karen would eventually sniff out like a raccoon at a trash bin. I wired it with a little surprise, a resistive load disguised as a simple connection designed to let her ATV draw current but at an increasingly unstable rate. Think of it like feeding someone spoiled food. It wouldn't hurt immediately, but the damage would build until the body rebelled. The day she found it, I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. I watched from behind the blinds as she strutted over, extension cord in hand, muttering something about how I should have just donated the power directly. She plugged in her ATV like she was performing some sacred ritual. I saw the tiny indicator light flicker. Perfect. The hook was in. From then on, her ATV became my silent accomplice. Every charge session stressed the system a little more, overheating wires she didn't understand, cooking circuits she'd never checked. She thought she was siphoning power for free, but what she was really doing was slow roasting her precious machine from the inside out. And all the while, she bragged louder and louder about how she was standing up to resource hogs like me in the HOA meetings. One evening, she even cornered me in front of the neighbors. "You see," she said, tapping her acrylic nail against her ATV's fender, "some of us share what we have. Others," she jabbed her finger toward me, "just hide behind locks and wires hoarding." The neighbors nodded, uncomfortable but too cowed to contradict her. I just smiled and sipped my coffee, imagining the sparks already chewing through her circuits. Still, I'll admit I started to feel a twinge of guilt when her teenage son tried to ride it around the block. He stalled out halfway and stomped home in a tantrum, yelling about how the thing kept cutting out. Karen smoothed it over by blaming me. "He must have tampered with the line," she announced. The accusation rolled off me like rainwater. I didn't rise to it. Let her double down. The more confident she became, the harder the fall would be. By week 3, the ATV was coughing like a smoker. It wouldn't hold charge, it sputtered on startup, and I could see Karen's frustration boil every time she smacked the handlebars. Her temper was delicious, each red-faced outburst a reminder that the trap was closing. Then came the twist I hadn't planned for. She marched onto my lawn one Saturday morning with 3 HOA board members trailing her like backup singers. "This man," she announced, pointing at me as if she were hosting a courtroom drama, "has been sabotaging my property. He cut into the wiring of my ATV. He's endangering me and my family." The sheer audacity nearly made me laugh out loud. She wanted to accuse me of sabotage while literally standing over the line she'd stolen from me. The board murmured, shifting awkwardly. They didn't want to confront her, but they also couldn't quite look me in the eye. "Karen," I said evenly, "are you accusing me of tampering with your ATV?" "Of course I am," she snapped. "It's been failing ever since he started meddling. He's an electrical hazard." I bent down and picked up the cord she'd left sprawled across my grass. "Funny, because this cord is yours. This outlet is mine. You want to explain to them why you've been charging here without permission." Her eyes flickered just for a moment. Then she laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Community resources," she said. "It's all been approved. Everyone knows." I looked at the board members. "Approved in writing?" I asked. "Or just approved because she says so?" They shuffled. One of them coughed. Karen's smile faltered. The seeds of doubt were planted, but it still wasn't enough. She was slippery, always managing to wriggle free with a new story. I needed something undeniable, something even she couldn't spin. That was when I realized the plan had one last step. The ATV was already on its last legs, but the finale had to be public. Quiet sabotage wasn't enough. I needed the whole neighborhood to witness her empire of arrogance literally go up in smoke. So I waited. I waited for the day she would trot it out as a spectacle again, revving it for the crowd, waving her flag of entitlement. And when that day came, I knew the final piece would fall exactly where it needed to. The cords were set. The circuits were primed. And the fire, when it came, wouldn't just consume her ATV. It would burn her lies to ash in front of everyone she ruled over. I didn't have to chase revenge. I just had to let her pride drive straight into it. The morning it finally happened, I knew before the first spark even flew. There was a tension in the air, the kind you get before a storm, when the sky is just a little too quiet and the birds keep their distance. Karen had plastered the neighborhood with flyers the night before, announcing what she called a community unity parade. Translation: she wanted everyone to watch her ride her ATV around like a county fair queen on her float. Attendance was strongly encouraged for all HOA members, which was her way of saying mandatory. By noon, the cul-de-sac was lined with folding chairs and families clutching lemonade cups. The parade was really just Karen, decked out in a rhinestone jacket like she thought she was starring in a rodeo, perched on her ATV. She waved to her subjects like a benevolent dictator. The machine was polished to a shine, though up close you could hear its insides coughing with every rev of the engine. I leaned against my mailbox with my arms folded, wearing my calmest smirk. Inside, my heart was thumping like a war drum. I didn't know the exact second the damage would hit critical, but I knew it would be today. Circuits don't forgive neglect forever, and her ATV had been running on borrowed time for weeks. The entire neighborhood was about to see what arrogance does when it ignores physics. Karen revved the throttle, sending a roar echoing down the street. "This is what sharing looks like," she shouted, her voice carrying over the engine. "When one of us prospers, we all prosper." She even threw in a wink in my direction, the kind of smug look that begged to be erased. The ATV sputtered once. Nobody noticed but me. My lips curled into the faintest grin. She kept circling, soaking in the attention, making sure everyone saw her nails glinting in the sunlight as she threw queenly waves. Then came the second sputter. This one was louder, an awkward hiccup that drew a few confused looks from the crowd. Karen waved it off, pretending it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. I could see the faint wisp of smoke already snaking from under the seat. My trap had been slow, deliberate, each overcharged session adding stress, each fake surge creeping closer to the edge. Now the edge was gone. The engine coughed like it had swallowed fire. Karen jerked forward, her hands slamming the handlebars. "It's fine," she shouted, voice cracking. "It's just warming up." She revved harder, as if bullying the machine into obedience would save her. That's when the sparks flew. A sharp crack, like a firecracker going off, snapped the air. A jet of smoke burst from the battery housing, followed by a flame licking up the plastic. The crowd gasped, mothers yanking children back, neighbors stumbling over folding chairs. Karen screamed, jumping off as the ATV belched fire like a dragon. The panic was instant. Someone shouted for water, another dialed 911, and Karen shrieked accusations through the smoke. "He did this. He sabotaged me." She jabbed her finger at me, her face red, her voice raw. "He's been after me since day one." I didn't move. I just stood there, calm as ever, arms crossed while her prized possession burned. The flames grew, melting the gaudy decals she'd plastered across it. The machine popped and groaned, plastic dripping like wax. The smell was acrid, a mix of chemicals and humiliation. Neighbors looked between us, unsure who to believe. But I didn't need to argue. Evidence doesn't shout. It smolders in the street where everyone can see it. The firefighters arrived within minutes, spraying foam until the blaze died with a hiss. Karen was hysterical, insisting I'd tampered with her wiring. The fire captain raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, from what I can see, this looks like a case of unsafe charging. Overloaded circuit. Do you know how it was wired?" Karen opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. "It was community power. He said I could." She faltered under the captain's skeptical stare. "You mean you were pulling power without a licensed connection?" he asked, his tone sharp now. "That's not just unsafe, that's illegal." The crowd shifted, murmurs rippling. Neighbors who'd been too scared to oppose her finally had an outlet for their whispers. I caught fragments. "She dug into his line? Didn't she break his panel lock? That's theft." The tide was turning, and Karen knew it. Her face twisted in fury, her crown of authority slipping fast. She doubled down, screaming over them. "No. He set me up. He rigged it. Look at him, standing there smirking." She was pointing, trembling with rage, but her words fell flat against the sight of the melted wreck in front of her. I finally spoke, quiet but cutting. "Karen, you stole my power. You destroyed my greenhouse. And now you've destroyed your own toy. I didn't have to lift a finger. Physics did it for me." The firefighters exchanged glances, clearly unimpressed with her theatrics. One of them even chuckled under his breath. The board members who'd stood behind her in past meetings avoided her eyes now. She was unraveling, and she knew it. But here's where it got even better. The HOA's insurance representative, who happened to live 3 doors down, stepped forward. "You realize," he said, adjusting his glasses, "that since this was caused by your illegal modifications and theft of utilities, the HOA won't cover the damages. You'll be personally liable for the fire and any property it could have spread to." Karen's mouth fell open. For the first time, she had no quick spin, no deflection. Just silence. That silence was worth more than every ruined orchid in my greenhouse. It was the sound of her empire cracking. Of course, she didn't accept defeat. Entitled people never do. Within an hour she was back on her porch, phone glued to her ear, shouting about lawyers and lawsuit. She paced in circles, still trying to convince herself she could win. But the neighborhood had seen it now. They'd seen the flames, the panic, the humiliation. She couldn't spin fire into a victory. Her ATV was gone, her credibility scorched, and for the first time since she'd seized the HOA presidency, she looked small. That night, as I watered what little remained in my greenhouse, I thought about how satisfying it had been to watch her pride combust. But I also knew it wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to retreat quietly. She would come back, meaner, more desperate, grasping for any shred of power she had left. And I was right, because 2 days later, I woke up to find an envelope taped to my door, a notice from the HOA, citing me for deliberate sabotage of community property and demanding thousands in fines. She wasn't done fighting. She was doubling down. The fire had only been the beginning. The real war was about to start. The envelope was thick, as if she thought adding weight would give her threats more substance. I stood there on my porch in the morning chill, flipping it over in my hands while sipping coffee. Karen's handwriting, all jagged loops and angry pressure, bled through the return address section. The HOA logo on the front was crooked, clearly printed off some ancient home printer she probably considered official. I opened it slowly, savoring the melodrama, and sure enough, it was everything I expected and worse. Notice of HOA violation and fine. The phrasing was pompous, deliberately legal-sounding, as though a court clerk had drafted it. In reality, it was just Karen sitting at her dining room table, fueled by caffeine and spite. The letter accused me of deliberate sabotage of her ATV, claiming I had willfully and maliciously tampered with community property. The fine totaled $7,842.63, right down to the cent because apparently arbitrary decimals made it seem legitimate. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. It was classic Karen. Her pride had been torched along with her ATV, so now she was scrambling to rewrite history. She couldn't let the neighborhood see her as the cause of her own downfall. If she couldn't win with facts, she'd try with paperwork. I crumpled the notice into a ball and tossed it into the recycling bin. On its own, it was harmless, empty threats scrawled on printer paper. But I knew better than to underestimate her persistence. Karen didn't need to be right to be dangerous. All she needed was noise, and noise spreads. By the next HOA meeting, her noise had turned into a symphony. She arrived early, arms loaded with binders and copies of her official documents. She passed them around like she was unveiling the Constitution. "We have a serious problem," she announced, her voice trembling with the effort of sounding composed. "A neighbor has endangered us all by sabotaging property and tampering with utilities. This behavior cannot stand." Her allies, those too timid or too gullible to think for themselves, nodded dutifully. But something had shifted since the fire. People glanced at me, then back at her, their expressions uncertain. The memory of her ATV melting into a puddle of shame was still fresh. She might have her papers, but I had physics on my side. I raised my hand, calm as ever. "Question," I said. "If her ATV was community property, then why did she keep it locked in her garage? Why wasn't anyone else allowed to use it?" The room shifted. Murmurs rippled. Karen's eyes widened before she forced a brittle smile. "Well, of course, not everyone knows how to operate such machinery safely. It required experience. Experience like wiring it illegally into my breaker box?" I asked. My tone was dry, but it landed like a hammer. Heads turned. A couple of neighbors chuckled nervously. Karen snapped. "He's lying. He's twisting things." Her composure cracked, her voice shrill enough to rattle the fluorescent lights. "He rigged it to explode." "Funny," I said, "that the fire captain called it unsafe charging. Did you forget he told you that in front of all of us?" She stammered, searching for words, but the silence that followed was deadly. Her usual tactic, steamrolling the room with volume, wasn't working this time. Too many people had seen too much. That night, she escalated again. I caught her prowling near my greenhouse, her flashlight beam slicing through the leaves. I stood on my porch and cleared my throat. She froze, then pasted on a fake smile. "Just inspecting," she said sweetly. "HOA business." "Funny," I replied, I don't remember granting you jurisdiction over my tomatoes." She stomped off, muttering something about citations. The war was becoming open now, a cold war turning hot. Karen filed bogus fines, left nasty notes on my door, even stood outside my property taking photos like some deranged paparazzi. But the harder she pushed, the more cracks formed in her facade. Neighbors grew tired of her antics. A few even came to me privately, whispering that they were on my side but too afraid to speak up publicly. That's when I realized Karen's greatest weapon wasn't her shouting. It was fear. She ruled by intimidation, making everyone think opposing her would bring ruin. But fear has a half-life. The fire had already shortened it. All I had to do was finish the job. So I dug deeper. Not into her wires this time, but into her records. A friend at City Hall owed me a favor, and within a week I had copies of filings, permits, and property records. That's where I struck gold. Karen's ATV? It wasn't even street legal. She'd filed a fraudulent exemption form, claiming it was for agricultural purposes. On top of that, she'd tapped into community funds to cover her insurance, disguising it as grounds maintenance equipment. The hypocrisy was perfect. The same woman who fined people for having mailboxes an inch too tall had been stealing money from the HOA to fuel her joyride. I didn't confront her directly. Not yet. I knew better than to waste evidence on a one-on-one shouting match. No, this was something that needed an audience. So I waited until the next board meeting, documents tucked neatly into a folder, while Karen strutted in with her usual parade of binders. She launched into another tirade about me being a threat to community stability. Half the room looked bored, the other half just tired. Then I stood, calm and deliberate. "Before we continue, I'd like to submit some information to the board," I said, handing the folder to the secretary. The silence was instant as pages shuffled. Karen's face paled as she recognized the forms. She tried to interject, but the board president raised a hand. "Is this true?" he asked her, his tone sharp. She stammered, flailing for excuses, but the words died in her throat. The neighbors were murmuring louder now, angry, betrayed. The Queen's crown was slipping fast, and this time she couldn't glue it back on with paperwork. That's when she snapped. She slammed her fist on the table, papers scattering. "This is harassment," she shrieked. "He's obsessed with me. He's dangerous." But nobody was listening. The tide had turned completely. A motion was called to audit the HOA's finances. Another motion to suspend Karen's presidency until the review was complete. Hands shot up, faster than I'd ever seen. Her face was a portrait of shock. 4 years she'd ruled unchecked, and now the empire was crumbling under her own corruption. She stormed out of the meeting, binder clutched to her chest like a shield. But as the door slammed behind her, I knew this wasn't the end. People like Karen don't retreat quietly. They don't learn humility. They lash out, desperate to cling to any shred of control. I walked home under the streetlights, the folder under my arm, a rare sense of satisfaction humming in my chest. I'd exposed her. I'd pulled the mask off the tyrant. But the war wasn't over. When I got back to my porch, another envelope was waiting. No HOA logo this time. Just a handwritten note in the same jagged scrawl. "You'll regret this." And for the first time, I believed she meant it. The note on my porch didn't scare me. Karen wasn't capable of subtle threat. If she wanted revenge, she'd make it loud, messy, and impossible to ignore. And that's what worried me. Not the possibility that she'd come after me in secret, but the certainty that she'd do it in broad daylight, dragging the whole neighborhood into her theater of vengeance. For a few days she went quiet. No notes, no fines, no late-night prowling. Just silence. But Karen was like a storm cloud. When the air got too still, you knew a downpour was coming. I kept up my routines. Tending the greenhouse, jogging in the mornings, coffee on the porch, but always with one eye open, waiting for the inevitable. It came on a Saturday. I woke to the sound of engines, not one but several, rumbling down the street. I stepped outside and froze. Karen was marching toward my yard at the head of a small convoy. 2 trucks hauling trailers loaded with construction supplies, 3 HOA board members in tow like reluctant soldiers, and, unbelievably, a hired crew of laborers carrying tools. She planted herself in my driveway, hands on her hips, voice booming. "This property is in violation of community standards," she declared. "As of today, the HOA is repossessing the greenhouse for community use." The audacity nearly made me laugh. "Repossession?" I asked. "That's not even a legal term for private property." Karen ignored me, waving her arm like a general commanding troop. "Boys, take it down. We'll use the materials for the new community center. This selfishness has gone on long enough." The workers hesitated, looking uncertain. They weren't neighbors. They were day laborers she must have paid off Craigslist, and they clearly weren't thrilled about the idea of demolishing a greenhouse with the owner standing right there. One of them glanced at me. "Is this legal?" he asked quietly. "No," I said simply. "Touch one pane of glass and you'll be trespassing." Karen snapped, her voice shrill. "Don't listen to him. He's been sabotaging the neighborhood for months. He's a danger to us all." The board members shuffled awkwardly, none of them daring to back her up. They'd been burned too many times by her lies. And that's when I pulled my final card. For weeks I'd been patient, letting her dig her own grave. But I hadn't shown everything I had. I'd kept the biggest piece of evidence hidden until I knew she'd crossed the line so far there'd be no crawling back. I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen. Within seconds, the projector I'd mounted under my porch eaves lit up, casting a crisp video feed against the side of my garage. The whole neighborhood could see it. Grainy security footage of Karen, screwdriver in hand, prying open my breaker box. Another clip of her dragging the orange extension cord across my lawn. Another of her ATV plugged into my dummy socket, the faint flicker of sparks as the damage began. The gasps from the neighbors were delicious. The workers stopped in their tracks, staring at the wall-sized projection. Karen's face went pale, then red, then pale again. "This," I said calmly, "is what theft looks like. This is who's been endangering the community." The silence was heavy, broken only by the hum of the trucks still idling. Finally, one of the board members cleared his throat. "Karen, this is serious. This isn't just a violation. This is criminal." Karen shrieked, pointing at me like a witch hunter. "He doctored that footage. He's framing me." But her voice cracked. Nobody believed her anymore. Not after the ATV fire, not after the fraudulent forms, and now not with video evidence staring them in the face. One of the workers dropped his tool belt. "Lady, I'm not going to jail for this," he muttered. He climbed back into the truck. The others followed, refusing to touch so much as a screw on my greenhouse. Within minutes, the convoy peeled away, leaving Karen stranded in my driveway with her so-called army dissolve. The board members didn't follow her either. They muttered apologies, ducked their heads, and slipped away, wanting no part of the disaster. Karen was alone. And that's when the police cars rolled in. You see, I hadn't just set up cameras. I'd filed a report weeks ago, quietly, with all my logs and data. When Karen escalated to attempted demolition, it was the final straw. The officers stepped out, calm but firm. "Ma'am," one of them said, "we need to speak with you about some reports of utility theft and property damage." Karen tried her usual tactics: denials, tears, accusations, but the officers weren't swayed. They had the footage, the reports, even witness statements from neighbors who'd finally found the courage to speak. The cuffs clicked shut around her wrists. The queen of the HOA, dragged away screaming down the cul-de-sac, while her neighbors watched in stunned silence. As the squad car pulled out, one of the officers lingered. "You did a good job documenting everything," he said quietly. "People like her. They count on nobody keeping records. You made it easy." I nodded, thanking him, though the real satisfaction wasn't in the police report. It was in the looks on my neighbors' faces, the relief, the disbelief, the dawning realization that Karen's reign of terror was finally over. Over the next few weeks, the HOA scrambled to pick up the pieces. Emergency elections were called. New policies were written. And for the first time in years, the meetings didn't feel like court sessions presided over by a dictator. People laughed. They debated. They spoke freely. Karen's house sat dark and empty while her legal troubles mounted. Rumors flew, fines, lawsuits, insurance claims denied, but I didn't pay much attention. She was no longer my problem. I rebuilt the greenhouse. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Each pane of glass I set back in place felt like reclaiming more than just a structure. It felt like reclaiming the neighborhood itself, brick by brick, wire by wire. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the new irrigation pump hummed softly, a few neighbors came by with folding chairs and beers. They thanked me, not just for standing up to Karen, but for showing them that her power had always been smoke and mirrors. I smiled, raised my bottle, and said, "Physics doesn't care about titles. You can only fight gravity and electricity for so long before they remind you who's boss." They laughed, but it was true. Karen had spent years bending people to her will. But she couldn't bend volts, or fire, or truth. In the end, her empire collapsed not because I shouted the loudest, but because I was patient enough to let her dig her own hole, and smart enough to wire it so the fall burned. And that, I suppose, was the lesson. Entitlement can shout, threaten, and bully. But arrogance always combusts eventually. Sometimes literally. As the night settled over the cul-de-sac, the greenhouse lights flickered on, casting a warm glow over the plants inside. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the hum of fans, the quiet chatter of neighbors, and the peaceful absence of one voice that had once drowned out everything else. Karen had dug into my wiring. But in the end, it wasn't my system that failed. It was hers.